and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 10th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We will be covering the fourth night of riots in LA. We're going to cover that on today's show. But first, we're going to get through the domestic and global sit reps. Jared, good morning. Let's go ahead and start with this bill to secure ports. If you can, just remind us, there are these Chinese cranes, Chinese manufactured port cranes in the United States. I guess they're Wi-Fi enabled. There's a lot of concern that they could be hacked or disrupted or otherwise exploited by China in a time of crisis or conflict. So what's the latest here?
Yes. So this comes from the House of Representatives. They put forward a new bill which is going to prohibit Chinese, North Korean, Iranian, or Russian entities from owning U.S. ports as determined by the Transportation Department to be national security risks. And the House is also considering another bill that would authorize the use of Transportation Department grants to replace Chinese-made port cranes inside of the United States ports.
Mm-hmm. And then this is a bill, you say, is this attached to anything? What's the likelihood this is actually going to make it through Congress?
I don't have a good read on that. This was Robert's piece. He dropped it in.
Okay,
but I can go double check that and get an answer for you.
Okay, well, that's fine. I mean, I would expect it to sail through, but time is of the essence. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Senator Chris Murphy. So back in March, I started following him because he was very supportive of the protests. And one of the things that he told to an audience, a town hall audience back in late March, is he started talking about Democrats taking what he characterized as exceptional tactics. And basically what he was telling people is that Democrat leaders need to start taking risks because there's going to come a time when Democrats ask the rank and file to take risks, meaning action against the Trump administration. And the rank and file won't go along unless they see Democratic leaders doing this first. And so this is probably a reason why we have seen members of Congress out in these protests and leading their own civil disobedience type of campaigns. We saw one in New Jersey last month and a couple of others. We've seen Democrats at these protests. At any rate, most recently, he has renewed those calls for mass mobilization. He started saying that back in March. It's now June. He's still beating that drum. What's the latest?
Yep, this was on an interview yesterday. He said, quoting, "This is a moment where we have to be on the street all over the country to protest what's happening to our immigrant community, but more broadly to protest what's happening to our democracy." Murphy went on to claim that Trump is actually trying to raise the heat in LA so that Trump has a reason to invoke the Insurrection Act.
Mm-hmm. Well, he could be right about that. We're going to talk about LA here in just a few moments. Let's move on now to there's a third Chinese agent that has been arrested for carrying biological agents into the United States. And there's a lot of speculation that this is not just that these are not isolated incidents. They are maybe part of a broader campaign. Jared?
Yes. This is a Chinese PhD student from Wuhan, that Wuhan. Her last name is Han, so I'll refer to her as that. She flew into the metro. She was arrested while flying into the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. And Han had previously smuggled over 2024 and 2025 biological material related to roundworms. And she sent them to the University of Michigan, hence why she was heading to Detroit. Upon her arrest, she knowingly lied to the arresting agents about the material and the fact that she had smuggled it. And the agents found that she had erased her phone 3 days prior to entering the United States as well. So she was trying to cover her tracks electronically. Mm-hmm. The Justice Department didn't specify what type of roundworm it was, but that can cause radically different symptoms from basically asymptomatic up to anemia and severe weight loss.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just say this. If we do get into a crisis or conflict, a worsening crisis or an actual armed conflict with China, you should expect that many parts of your daily lives and routines will be disrupted somehow. It may not be the food supply. You should consider that. And just in terms of being prepared, any war that we fight over in the Indo-Pacific is going to have implications here at home because China has the ability to reach out and touch someone, not only through cyber, but also through domestic sabotage, which I would wholeheartedly expect. And so consider your food supply implications. And I'll just say that and we'll move on. Lastly, here, DHS is trying to get people to self-deport. They say that they will forgive their fines if people just leave the country.
Yep. And in order to make sure that these people are actually doing this, DHS is asking them to go through the CBP Home app. They're saying, "Hey, we will waive your fines, which are $1,000 per day." Just recently, somebody made the headlines for having like $1.8 million in fines outstanding. So the department is also offering totally covering the cost of travel, and once they're confirmed to be in their destination, giving them $1,000 payment to leave. So we'll waive your fines. We'll give you $1,000. We'll pay for your entire cost so that you leave. Just confirm that you're gone. And I mean, this is really the carrot to the stick that we're seeing in LA here.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that update, Jared. And let's move on to the global sit rep. Just a couple of items. Mexico has opinions on these LA riots. What's the latest?
They sure do. So this was at Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum's press conference yesterday. She said that Mexico would continue to use all diplomatic channels to the U.S. to protest what she calls the criminalization of migration in the United States. She also added that Mexico's first priority is to defend them, illegal aliens in the United States, in a comprehensive sense, not only for being Mexican, but because they contribute so much to the Mexican economy with their remittances.
Mm-hmm. By the way, just looking ahead to the midterms, we may see more. I would characterize this as meddling in U.S. elections. I did a deep dive into this yesterday, but we reported on it at the time. Back in 2023, then Mexican President AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, said that the Republicans had basically a backwards immigration policy, and he called on Mexican nationals in the United States to vote against the Republicans if they continued on with those types of immigration policies. And he said something like this several times. It has not gotten a lot of play in U.S. media. We've obviously covered it because we're paying attention to it. Also, I think I said this yesterday. It was not May 2024. I believe it was May 2023. Marcelo Ebrard, who is currently the economic minister in Mexico, in 2023, he was the foreign affairs, basically the Secretary of State of Mexico. I think it's called the Foreign Affairs Secretary. He traveled to Florida and he campaigned against Ron DeSantis, and he held these rallies with Mexican nationals. And he was saying Ron DeSantis and then candidate Trump have these racist immigration policies, and Mexican nationals in the United States, presumably dual citizens, have to go out and vote against Republicans. And so this is just a continued effort to have Mexicans influence our elections, and maybe they're dual citizens, but this is a foreign country lobbying their foreign diaspora to vote against Republicans. And this is something that may come up again in the midterms. So don't be surprised by it, because now we have an administration that will probably just not allow this to happen that easily. All right, Jared, thanks for that. And then lastly here, Iran's been threatening military action in response to, because Israel's been threatening military action against Iran. What's the latest?
Yes, this is coming from Iran's Supreme National Security Council. They warned Israel directly yesterday that they would strike Israel's undeclared nuclear weapons, Iran's term, if Israel attacked Iran's nuclear energy infrastructure. Iran further claimed that they would do this accurately because they had conducted a clandestine operation inside of Israel to gather all the information in order to conduct these strikes. So this is something they've been preparing for a while.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, and bottom line, the Trump administration tried to wind this down, trying to strike a deal with Iran so that this does not blow up. But I'm not sure the Iranians or the Israelis will be very pleased in that deal. So it kind of leads me to believe that maybe it won't happen, but we'll see. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about these LA riots. So yesterday I said I'd have a full assessment yesterday afternoon. I do have a partial assessment, which I'll share with you now. And I will just say this. I actually think this is the turning point here. So this unrest, the riots and protests in Los Angeles continued through last night. Looters targeted downtown retail stores. They targeted the Apple store, CVS, and Adidas, among others. And this looting appears to be opportunistic. You can go back and look at the videos. And let's just say this. It doesn't look like Mexicans are looting the Apple store. Okay. And so it looks wholly unrelated to the anti-ICE protests and riots. It's just a completely different demographic that's involved in looting. Also, Los Angeles police chief continues to say that his officers are overwhelmed. And this is even as state and local leaders say that federal support is just not required here to support local law enforcement. Meanwhile, in recent days, President Trump has remained adamant that more troops will be deployed if the situation warrants. He said, quote, "We're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country. We're not going to let our country be torn apart." And this appears to be one of the many lessons learned from his administration from back in 2020. Yesterday, we talked about when these kinds of low-intensity conflicts or revolutionary movements, or in some cases insurgencies, do begin, there's a tendency by governments to wait too long. And if you wait until the overt attacks of an insurgency, it's too late. It's too late to turn back the violence, and to turn back the violence easily. And we are probably here seeing this in LA and now starting to spread to other cities. It does look like the Trump administration is not trying to wait too long for this. So far, about 700 Marines from 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 2-7, have arrived in Los Angeles. This is days after they were placed on standby. And then apparently they started mobilizing maybe on Sunday, but definitely by Monday. And I have been in contact with several Marines from 2-7. I asked one of them how he felt about this deployment. He said, quote, "feeling ready." And some other Marines from 2-7 also told me that their mission was not domestic law enforcement. So this is something that we have known, but it has not stopped a pretty visceral reaction to the anti-Trump and Trump resistance 2.0 movements, who have brought up posse comitatus and saying this is illegal and unconstitutional. And they're using, the Trump administration is going to use these Marines against U.S. citizens. And that is just simply not the case. These Marines will be providing security for federal personnel and the ICE facility, which have been attacked for days now. And this is despite California and the city of Los Angeles saying, we're doing everything we can to keep these protests peaceful. It's simply not the case. I've also heard, and this is speculation, rumor, whatever you want to call it, but another Marine told me that another battalion from 29 Palms could also be deployed in the coming days or weeks. I'm not saying that will happen, but I believe that is a distinct possibility if the situation warrants. If they do, they would join about 2,000 National Guardsmen already conducting security operations outside that ICE facility. And we've heard reports yesterday that an additional 2,000 National Guard troops are being mobilized to deal with this civil disturbance. So that'll be pretty close to 5,000 military personnel on site in Los Angeles for this. For now, these active duty Marines are being called up for or being deployed under Title 10 orders, along with the National Guard as well. In the case of the National Guard, they are, according to their orders, they're scheduled to conduct security operations for up to 60 days, or, quote, at the discretion of the Secretary of Defense. So these could potentially go longer. ICE officials last weekend told Los Angeles officials to prepare for 30 days of ICE enforcement operations, so we can expect this to run into July. Meanwhile, California Governor Gavin Newsom filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, saying that the mobilization of the California National Guard without his approval was illegal. That's what he says. I'm not a legal scholar, but I have read some work from legal scholars, and they say this is completely legal. Because if you read the letter of the law under Title 10, it's very clear under the express wording, quote, "The president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws." And this applies to, quote, "when there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States." So it appears that a court ruling, if I expect this to survive the courts, honestly, but if there is some type of injunction, it will probably hinge on whether or not a federal judge believes the Los Angeles rioting, which does impede enforcement of federal law, constitutes a rebellion. And so that's maybe a legal gray area as to what this federal judge may or may not say. I think this is another reason why Gavin Newsom and LA Mayor Karen Bass are telling people to remain peaceful so they can win this fight against the Trump administration. My expectation is that the National Guard mobilizations will not only continue, I will continue to see National Guardsmen in Los Angeles, unless we get a ruling from what I would probably characterize as a rogue federal judge, or at least a federal judge who said this is not a rebellion. At any rate, we're probably looking at additional cities we're looking at additional National Guard troops being mobilized for additional cities if unrest poses a security risk to federal law enforcement. Now, I've also seen numerous politicians attempt to blame the Trump administration for the unrest, saying that the riots didn't start happening until federal law enforcement conducted militarized raids on some workplaces. And that actually is technically true. But we have covered numerous times on the show that there have been months of protests and in some cases scuffles, like direct action against federal law enforcement in Los Angeles. And so the unrest was already there and it was already building. And not only was it already building, this is part of a coordinated campaign, because back in March in this report, in our daily early warning report, we pointed out that the Los Angeles City Council voted to provide money and resources to help safeguard illegals from ICE raids. They also asked state lawmakers to increase taxpayer funding for deportation defense. So this is something that has happened all the way up at the city level. They have clearly been doing this. This is clearly a coordinated effort to block federal law enforcement, and this has overall encouraged a response from the Trump administration. Now, not that I put a lot of faith in polling, but I think some of these polls can be generally accurate. A recent YouGov poll found that nearly half the country, or about 45%, disapproves of the anti-ICE protests. That was compared to 36% that approve. That breaks down largely among party lines. But that poll also found that a majority of the country, at 50%, say they disapprove of how President Trump is handling deportations. Meanwhile, 39% say they approve it. Again, that's broken down largely among party lines, that difference there. So my assessment is, last year, just from tracking all these far left groups, the question was, well, are they going to riot for the election if Trump wins? And then it was, are they going to riot during the inauguration if Trump is inaugurated? And I was just looking at the state of the far left, and I said, these guys are demoralized. They're not talking about it. They're not planning for it. They're not holding training. They were trying to hold like workshops and get-togethers and stuff. But there was nothing that they were saying or doing that led me to believe that there were going to be riots if Trump won the election in November 2024. And I told everyone that at the time. I said, I'm extremely doubtful that they will happen, despite lots of predictions. And then there were predictions of riots around the inauguration. And I continued to look at these far left, the Antifa groups, and I said, they're not getting ready to riot for the inauguration. The inauguration riots are not going to happen, clearly. And then they didn't happen. And so I've been looking, my baseline expectation has been that this summer we will not repeat a summer of 2020. I still don't think we will. Although the summer will be quite lovely, I don't think it will reach the level of 100 plus, 120, 150 days of rioting, which is an impossibility because there's not 150 days left in summer. But yesterday on the show, I questioned, is this a moment? Is this something that's going to be limited and contained to Los Angeles, or is this going to be a movement? And there's a couple of things that lead me to believe that this is likely to spread to other cities, which I think at this point is just fairly obvious. I've seen numerous images and videos coming out of Los Angeles showing individuals wearing those neon green hats, And those are National Lawyers Guild. They're sometimes volunteer observers. Most often, I think they're attorneys. And they look for civil rights violations by law enforcement against protesters and rioters. And so that is by far the largest signal that there's some organization behind these protests and riots. In one video, there's an individual that's seen shouting through a bullhorn, quote, "If you get arrested, call this number. We will bail you out for free." And this is in line with some previous campaigns that we've seen where bail funds were set up, and pro bono legal support, legal services have also been set up to assist those activists and militants who get arrested. And so as a result, this is something I've pointed out in the past couple of months, militants are more likely to take risks, i.e., such as engaging in violent behavior and criminal activity, if they know they have legal support. They have not had that in previous months. With National Lawyers Guild now and these bail funds being set up and legal services, pro bono legal services being set up, they do have that, which I think is very significant. That increases the likelihood that we will see more violence when they know that if they get arrested, they're going to be bailed out of jail and they're going to get a free attorney and they're going to be able to plead down because they're in a somewhat sympathetic criminal justice environment. I'll say that. Although they are being arrested and charged. So we have seen protests ramp up in other cities like Houston and Austin, Philadelphia. There have been others, Chicago, Minneapolis. There's been direct action in Minneapolis where activists and militants try to go out and de-arrest some of these illegals who are being detained by ICE. So I look at that and then these other factors. I am seeing some early indicators of far left organizing in these cities. And, previously many of them have said they're demoralized. And one said in the past year, one of these anarchist podcasts, these people were laughing about another insurrection. They just said, yeah, it's just not possible. The conditions are not right for another insurrection. And everything I've seen from Antifa groups is it's been very, very difficult to get out and get the things that they need lined up in order to go out and conduct these direct action demonstrations and go be violent. We have seen a number of limited direct action demonstrations. Many of those have ended in arrests and they were broken up by police. So this is not 2020 anymore. And I don't think law enforcement, I don't think city leaders have a great appetite to allow these riots to take place. But I think the risk that riots spread to additional cities is obviously high. So I look at this, and this is almost certainly the spark that these far left groups have been looking for, because now they're saying, well, this is possible. We actually can go out and riot. We actually can go out and conduct direct action demonstrations. We can fight with police. And if National Lawyers Guild and these bailout funds continue to happen in other cities, we're going to see Los Angeles spread to other cities. And so we're probably ending the relative lack of activity that we've seen since the end of the George Floyd riots in 2021. Those did not end. They did not all end in 2020. They continued into 2021. And so just to put a bow on this, we'll move on. There is a notable difference. I've talked about law enforcement in Seattle and Portland and other cities, apparently sometime in 2021 or maybe between 2021 and 2023 or 24. There was some assembly or some summit of police chiefs working with federal law enforcement to adopt a strategy to counter this, I would say, like proto-insurgency style violence. It's not an outright insurgency. You could call it proto-insurgent, but it is at least and meets the level of insurrection or rebellion. And so I don't see a great appetite from these police departments to allow this to happen. I don't see a great appetite for city leaders to allow this to happen. And you look at LA and it really is the belly of the beast. And this is something that Stephen Miller has said, a Trump administration official. And he said, California is pretty much the worst offending state because they have aided and abetted and really facilitated this invasion of illegals because California is a sanctuary state. And so I think this is maybe one reason why there is such a response by the Trump administration in Los Angeles. I think maybe they're trying to win the fight. Maybe they are. Maybe there is a case where they can have some sort of decisive victory, where if they can put systems in place where rioters are arrested and enough of them are getting arrested, and then you follow through with criminal charges, and then I look at the rioters kind of like the ID emplacers in Afghanistan. Okay, there was no end of ID emplacers. We killed them by the scores, and IDs kept being emplaced. That is not the center of gravity for IDs, the emplacement. Okay, that's like the end user almost. The center of gravity for the IED cells was the chemists. It was the people who made the explosives. It was the people who made the trigger systems, made the actual pressure plates and all the various types of IEDs. And we realized when you target the chemists, the quality of homemade explosive goes down. And then you get these low order detonations, and then IEDs are not effective. Or in some cases, they dry up because some of these IED cells had pressure plates to put in the ground, but they didn't have anything that then went boom. So that was the center of gravity for them. The center of gravity for these rioters is not the rioters themselves. There will be no end of individual rioters. So arrest them, charge them, that's fine. But that will not end the riots. You have to go to the facilitators. You have to go to the organizers. And you've got to start putting RICO charges on them. Criminal conspiracy, because that's exactly what this is. Criminal conspiracy to conduct attacks against law enforcement, criminal conspiracy for property damage, et cetera, et cetera. And when you go after the actual facilitators, that is when you are going to see an end to the rioting. So I can only hope that DOJ understands this and they have a system in place where they can conduct investigations and find the people who are organizing and supporting, monetarily, materially supporting the riots, and go after them, because that is the center of gravity in this scenario. Someone asked me, Mike, what would you do if you're the Trump administration? Attack the center of gravity. You got to go after these people with criminal conspiracy charges, with the RICO charges. And so one can only hope that RICO cases are being built right now. Hold your breath, I guess. All right. With that, let's go ahead and move on. We do have 72 protests coming up today. That is above baseline. Also, remember, we do have this June 14th National Day. Well, first was the National Day of Protest, and then they started calling it National Day of Action. Now they're calling it National Day of Resistance. I will just tell you, this is by far the best opportunity that these far-left groups, predominantly the Antifa affinity groups, have to go out and test the waters, to go engage in violent behavior, criminal behavior, property damage, etc., smashing the windows of the local Starbucks, taking it to the man, ending the corporatocracy at Starbucks. I'd say there's a high risk of seeing this weekend. This could not only be the largest single-day protest that we've had since 2020. I think that April 5th, hands-off day, probably had like maybe 3 million, maybe a little north of there, 3 million protesters nationwide. I'm not sure if this will be bigger. It could be, obviously. But in terms of Antifa and other far-left activity, this could be the biggest day we've seen since 2021. So think back, put on your thinking caps. Think back. If you saw localized Antifa direct action violence in 2020, in your city, there's a good chance you will see it again this probably Saturday night, but really at any point over the weekend. So with that, thanks for bearing with me. And then, Jared, I think we do have one other item today, which is yesterday you talked about this Liaoning carrier strike group sailing past the second island chain. There's apparently a second carrier now. So what's going on?
Yes, the Chinese deployed a second carrier strike group. It would have had to be deployed for a few days, so this is just now hitting the airwaves. This is the Shandong carrier strike group, and they are in the Western Pacific, which is sometimes also called the Philippine Sea, as you can see here on the map. Sorry, give me one.
All right. Well, while
sorry,
we wait for
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
It's summer break. So, per the Japanese defense officials that released this information, this marks yet another first. This is the third milestone that we've seen from the Chinese in about a week. The Chinese has not had two carrier strike groups operating in the Pacific at the same time prior to now. Now, just to kind of set some potential fears at ease, Taiwan's only reporting 6 People's Liberation Army Navy ships in the last 24 hours with no Coast Guard. So this doesn't look like they are preparing for a blockade. Obviously, that could change inside of 36 hours. So, don't. It just doesn't look like it right now. Anyway, I think China may be preparing for probably the largest and most complex drill we've ever seen, because we've not seen them set these up. And if you were going to run a carrier versus carrier strike group operation, these would be great positions to do it. You start west of the second island chain, pretending to be the American strike group, and come in to face off against your primary operational strike group, the Shandong. I think that's what we are actually about to see. I'll happily be proven wrong. I'd prefer they go do just dual carrier ops and sail alongside each other for a little bit. But this would actually make a couple of different major milestones for them. First, they don't normally run complex drills. They run very scripted drills. So actually running true, force on force drills would be a major change for them. Obviously, where they are operating, huge change over the last couple of years. I do want to note that the Shandong is actually a little bit farther out than what is normally seen. Normally, we see the Chinese carrier strike group right up next to Taiwan. However, the PRC amphibious readiness group up there near Taiwan may be taking that role. It is kind of on the wrong side, though, so I'm not sure if we're going to see this in 36, 48 hours. What's going on there? I will be keeping track of this to find out what exactly they do here, though.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is interesting. You're saying that the Liaoning is going to, at some point, turn around, start sailing west, and essentially be a red team, or be the opposing forces, be the U.S. carrier strike group sailing into Taiwan, allowing the Shandong to practice targeting, practice SIGINT, practice its warfighting capabilities against the Liaoning.
So the Liaoning has already started heading back toward the mainland. Okay. They went way far out from the second island chain and then came back, and their last reported position was still on the far side of it. So they are heading in. I think they are preparing to do those drills. Again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope the Chinese are not prepared to do that. But yes, they do also. So I dropped in the little surface action group right there with the Liaoning. There are additional destroyers there as well. I think those would probably be representing like Japanese destroyers, because the carrier strike group is full. Which again plays into this. Looks like they're preparing for a drill. And I've previously said that the Chinese carriers are just not prepared to go toe to toe with a United States Navy carrier strike group. Like, we've watched the Navy degrade. They're not so degraded that they're definitely going to lose a 1v1 with the Chinese counterparts. They're going to, in my opinion, they're probably going to wipe the floor with them. But China's preparing to change that calculus.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jared, one thing the Taiwanese have said, and you've said this also for a couple of years now, is that a Chinese blockade of Taiwan is probably going to come on the heels of a major military exercise, like maybe the one we're seeing unfold now. If you just had to put a likelihood on it, what's the likelihood that at the end of this exercise, when China already has their PLAN assets in place, that we actually do see the beginning of a blockade here?
I would put it at maximum 2%.
Okay.
Very, very unlikely. And the reason I say that is that they still have to do like endurance training. Because we mentioned a couple months ago that I don't think I've ever seen them go for more than 2 months out at sea. And all of these strike groups have deployed only within the past couple of weeks. So they're going to be buttoned up on that limitation. They need to actually ramp that up. And on top of that, I think they're going to want their next carrier strike group operational before they move. But as a counterpoint, as I mentioned in January, I think the longer they wait, the worse their situation is going to get militarily. It's not going to improve because all of the U.S. and the U.S.'s allies systems are starting to come online and be deployed in this area. China's got to do something if they're going to do anything.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's a fair point, and also something that you've been tracking for several years now. So, thank you for that, Jared. And by the way, we do have some time for questions. If you do have a question, please just lead off with a capital Q so that Jared can find those questions. Could the Trump administration be using the riots as a way to shape the battle space? I think there is an argument to be made. I wouldn't necessarily call this shaping operations, but there is an argument to be made that the Trump administration sees political benefit in having LA riots continue because they're going to be plastered all over the TV screens. Riots are still very unpopular among Americans. Maybe there is I'm not saying this for sure because I don't know what the Trump administration is thinking or like the senior level Republicans. But maybe they see national riots in 2025 and maybe heading into next year as beneficial for Republicans in midterms. And I'm not saying this is their calculus. I'm just saying it's one possibility. If you are Republicans trying to hang on to the House majority, which is vital to the Trump administration, President Trump cannot lose Republican control of the House. And let me just say this, not that it entirely matters because, obviously there's a lot of Republican opposition to Trump inside the House and Senate. However, that's not exactly a showstopper. Democrats taking the House will be. So I think maybe there's a case to be made here that this is not exactly a shaping operation, but this is something to that effect, something to the effect of using it to Trump's benefit and maybe shape public opinion or shape perception of Democrats and the left, because Democrats they're obviously coming out and essentially defending these protests. So, yeah, good question. Why are we trying to get any deals with China and allowing Mexicans into the USA? Well, I think the allowing of Mexicans into the USA has probably stopped, except for legal immigration. By the way, there has been many calls for a moratorium on all immigration because of this. In terms of why we're trying to get deals with China, because China still makes things and has things that we need. We still need rare earth minerals. Trump administration officials and Chinese officials are in the second day of trade talks today, trying to hammer out a deal. China still has those rare earth metals that we need. So I think that is probably the reason. And look, a large portion of our economy still runs on Chinese imports. So that is, it's pretty vital for the U.S. economy, Jared.
Yep. I just want to point out something that I have noticed. Trump's not, so far he hasn't called for an immigration moratorium, though a lot of lower politicians have. But I have not seen a call for people-to-people exchanges with China and Mexico. That I think is very important, especially for China, because China demands people-to-people exchanges wherever they go. So even though we're demanding essentially material trade deals, not cultural exchange, and that is a big change from what we've seen over the last, decades, really. Mm. All right. We have a couple from from our beta testers. So could this weekend be the shot in the dark sort of the weekend? The Dems are pretty desperate. Well,
I guess I don't understand what shot in the dark. This is something before they even announced the date. This was back in April. I told you all June 14th is the next day. It's President Trump's birthday. It's the 250th anniversary of the Army parade, and they have to do something in June. So this is something that's been on my radar for months now. So I guess I don't really understand what shot in the dark means, but like a Hail Mary, I wouldn't call this a Hail Mary because Indivisible and 5051 and these other groups, Answer and others, they've been successful. I mean, there have been literally dozens of protests every day in this country, Monday through Friday, for a couple of months now. Now, most of these are like 5 or 10, maybe a couple dozen people. So they're not large protests, but they have been able to sustainably put hundreds of thousands of people into these large protests, and in some cases, millions of people. There's probably 3 million people for that April 5th hands off. That next was it April 20, whatever it was, just a couple weeks later, that was a big 50-51 thing. That's probably about 50% of the size, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands and maybe 1 million people. So May Day, I think, was not what they had hoped, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of people, including Antifa Black Bloc action that weekend in a handful of cities. So there is a good chance that this becomes the next high watermark for left-wing activism and direct action this coming weekend on Saturday.
The user clarified by shot in the dark, she means the item that historically kicks off a civil war. So basically shot heard around the world, not shot in the dark.
I don't think that would be a trigger. I think this is going to be an accelerator. I see Los Angeles as an accelerator. I see deployment of National Guard and Marines as an accelerator. I don't see them as triggers. Like it's not the equivalent of the George Floyd type trigger, which triggered 2020. And remember, those riots in 2020 did not just, they happened overnight practically, but there were 4 or 5 years in the making. All that BLM stuff started back in 2014, 2015. And so there were 5 years of agitation and smaller scale unrest. And then we had COVID. We had the COVID lockdowns. So many people weren't going to work. They weren't going to school. They were stuck at home. And then you had this lockdown induced recession, and then you had stimulus. So there are a lot of things that happened in 2020 that so far, keep your fingers crossed, have not happened in 2025. And until we see those accelerators, I don't think there's enough pressure built up into the system to explode into another 2020. That's not to say it couldn't happen at some point in the summer, but we have simply not had years of agitation consecutively like we saw in the lead up to 2020. So I still think this year is probably going to be a lot more like 2017, which still had riots. You still had Antifa Black Bloc action. You had mass protests, but I don't think it's going to, I think it's unlikely, not impossible, but I think it's unlikely to rise to the level of 2020, which was 150 days, straight days of nightly rioting. I don't think it's going to meet that. But again, the summer could get quite lovely. I don't think it's going to be the summer of love 2.0. Well, let me even that could be misconstrued. I don't think we will see the volume or intensity that we saw in 2020. How about that?
Next question, also from beta users. So China is pushing out its boundaries. Are they doing this as a show of force because of the trade talks? I don't think so. This is something that would take, probably 6+ months to plan out, because you have to do it on paper, actually get all of your forces ready, rotate them out for it takes a very long time. This is probably planned pre-Trump administration. That said, doesn't hurt to use it as a show of force, just opportunistically. All right. And next up.
How are they contributing to the Mexican economy by living in the U.S.? Well, remittances are about 4% of Mexican GDP. So I did the math on it last week. Remittances are down like 12% or something like that from,
I think so, yeah,
a few months ago. And so that's 1/10. Let's just call it 1/10 of 4%. So almost a 0.5% of Mexican GDP, a reduction, 0.5% reduction in GDP. Let's just call it that. So that's substantial for something as simple as immigration enforcement in the United States. I would expect that to continue to decrease the Mexican GDP as remittances are also dropped. Taxes are not going to help Mexico. Mexico's already on the verge of recession. I think they may actually be in a technical recession maybe. So Mexico does not have a 0.5% or 1% of GDP to shave off. So I think this is another big thing why this is it's another reason why it's a big deal for Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president.
Scheinbaum was also very careful to say that 80% of their pay stays inside of the United States, but that means 20% of their pay is leaving the United States. So that's how they're contributing to the Mexican economy. It's just extracting it. All right. Saw this one. I saw you had a post yesterday. Maybe it's worth addressing here.
Yeah, listen, every so often we see these Craigslist posts for rioters. Maybe in 2020, some of them were real, but these people were talking about, first of all, yeah, I don't know if you saw it, but it was comical. The Craigslist post calling for people to make $6,000 a day or whatever to like, we need the meanest people in Los Angeles to come get paid, whatever. And we're forming a crew. First of all, leftists don't talk like that. Number two, you got tons of criminals who go out and do that for free. They don't need to be paid. It's Los Angeles. And number three, someone advertised, you don't have job postings on Craigslist for $500,000 a year. Or you don't have $500,000 a year jobs posted on Craigslist, which fair point. On the topic of riots, can you talk a little bit about the kind of intelligence gathering that is likely going on? Do these protests represent a target-rich environment for ICE? Yeah, so there have been some media reports. I have not seen it in videos, but I haven't seen all the videos or all the pictures. Well, let's just start with SIGINT since you started there. SIGINT is not just radios. SIGINT is also, I guess you'd include telemetry data. You'd include cellular communications, that those are all signals that can be scooped up. And so I think we probably have seen some SIGINT collection platforms in the area. So I think that is obviously happening. I imagine you would have to get a warrant and maybe track certain cell phones or certain users or something like that. But that is an environment where you would traditionally be collecting SIGINT from people who are emitting signals. Remember, if it emits a signal, it can be tracked. OSINT, all these photos and videos are fantastic. The only reason, well, maybe not the only reason, but the best reason why I know National Lawyers Guild is on site is because we're seeing all those neon green hats all over the place. So there's a lot of OSINT collection happening, open source intelligence. So stuff that's put on social media and news reporting, all that is OSINT. Human reporting, I'm sure there are plainclothes police officers in the crowd talking to people. We have seen at least attempted infiltration into some of these groups. I know up in Seattle, FBI has been going around to some of these Antifa groups and individuals. There was one instance that happened, I think last month sometime. An FBI special agent showed up at the home of one of these Antifa organizers, and the organizer's roommate opened the door and invited the FBI agent in. So the FBI agent went in. And then this Antifa organizer came out of his room, and I'm sure he was livid that his roommate allowed federal law enforcement into their apartment. At any rate, so we know that federal law enforcement's hitting the ground and they're talking to people, and I'm sure they're trying to leverage human intelligence, confidential informants, whatever they have, leverage human to build out these networks and build out these maps. And then once you build out these networks, you look for the nodes, you look for the connectors, you look for the organizers, the facilitators, and then you target those organizers and facilitators. So I hope this is what's going on in terms of counterinsurgent or counter whatever you want to call this thing, counterinsurrection. So do these protests represent a target-rich environment for ICE? Yeah. Well, for ICE, for all federal law enforcement, sure. And I think this is probably mainly going to be FBI, probably spearheading most of the domestic collection and targeting. What's the difference between political speech and inciting an insurrection by leftist politicians? Okay, well, that's another great question. And when a politician comes out and says, we have to fight in the streets, that is probably not going to be taken as incitement to violence, because they can say, oh, this is a political and social fight. I was merely calling for peaceful protests. Okay. You have to talk to some attorney, probably criminal defense attorney or a prosecutor as to what actually constitutes political speech versus incitement to violence. But I would not be surprised to eventually see some people be maybe arrested for incitement to violence in some cases. Next question. Was the presentation from last Thursday posted somewhere? So no, it was not. But last Thursday I did do, this is part of the problem that's taken me such a long time to get around to these LA riots. I've had bonds on the brain. I did a deep dive into a potential debt crisis and bond market crisis for the United States. I read several books on the topic and did a presentation on Thursday night. And so I'm trying to get my brain out of that mode and back into this low intensity conflict stuff. So to answer your question though, that has not been posted somewhere. I'll try to get it up today. Actually, I will get it up today for everyone. Riots are ostensibly intended to coalesce support for a cause, but this strategy can risk backfire. Does President Trump have enough of a mandate and right strategy to prevail? Well, I do agree that riots can backfire. I've been saying for a couple of years now, Americans do not have the appetite to go through another 2020. Businesses don't want to board up their shops. They don't want their stores to be looted. City leaders don't want highways blocked and violence to occur because they're tired of hearing about it from their residents, citizens. So, and we know, like I've talked many times in Portland Police Bureau, the Portland City PD, they have engaged in essentially a counterinsurgency strategy against far left groups, predominantly like the Antifa affinity groups, to the point of conducting interrogations and trying to elicit information on the identities of other members of the Antifa groups. I'm not sure that was happening in 2020. It is for sure happening, or it was for sure happening in 2024, almost certainly into this year as well. So I actually think a great many assets are being leveraged to do this. And I think one of the reasons why we have not seen Antifa openly recruit like they have in previous years is because it is a more difficult security environment. It's more difficult to recruit. It's more difficult to maintain OPSEC. It's more difficult to operate when you have a Trump administration that learned from the first go around and is committed to not making the same mistakes as the second go around. Now, in terms of does President Trump have enough of a mandate to prevail? Ultimately, yes, we're going to hear shrieking from Democrats and from the left, but I think a great many moderates do not want to see these riots. They may not like Trump's strategy to combat the rioting, but they hate to see the rioting. And I think that's ultimately bad for Democrats who are, and even I look at what Democrats are saying. And, back in 2017, they were making excuses. Oh, the riots are the language of the unheard. And, oh, if you don't want to get punched in the face, maybe try not being a fascist. They're not saying that stuff today. They're saying, do not riot. This plays into Trump's strategy. You're helping the Trump administration when you go out and commit acts of violence. They were not saying that in 2020. They're saying it today. So I even think that has changed. So I think this probably does play into the Trump mandate. Now, is this the right strategy? Well, I think the right strategy is you've got to go after the organizers and facilitators, which I've been saying for some time. That is the center of gravity. If you can undercut the facilitators and undercut the organizers, make them less effective, you will have an impact on the number of people mobilized and also have an impact on probably the amount of property destruction and the intensity of the demonstrations that take place. So does he have the right strategy to prevail? I hope he does. We'll see. If people start getting frog marched out for RICO charges, then I would say they probably have the right strategy. Because that was extremely effective in Georgia, that Stop Cop City movement, years worth of occupations and direct action and arsons and lots of property damage. And Georgia State Police went in and arrested 60 of these people and charged them under RICO statutes and also charged them with criminal conspiracy and charged them under a handful under domestic terrorism statutes as well. We have not heard a peep from Stop Cop City. As a matter of fact, that main Stop Cop City group has folded. They basically no longer exist. They exist as they exist as individuals. But as a movement, conducting direct action has not happened. So I think that is a very, very good way forward for the Trump administration here. All right, we'll do a couple questions, and we're going long. Second day in a row. Does there seem to be any indication that the Justice Department is investigating Democrat lawmakers? I don't know. If they are, I don't know if we'd necessarily hear about it.
All right. That is not the last one, but the next one's about an executive order that I have not read yet to give an answer. The drone executive order. I'll read that, save this for tomorrow, and then we'll answer it.
Okay. All right. Well, that's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Everyone, thanks so much for the support. If you're a first-time listener, we do this every morning starting at 08 Central Time, and we appreciate you watching. By the way, if you're a beta tester, please do stay on our new intelligence platform. We are under an accelerated timeline now to get that rolled out in light of what's going on in LA and what will probably happen in other cities across the country. We're going to try to deploy that website actually this week. Actually, I think we're going to try to get it up today and then start moving users over. So with that, everyone, thanks so much for the support. Big, beautiful things ahead for us in terms of domestic, the intelligence we're able to produce on the domestic situation. I'll say that. With that, everyone, that'll do it for real. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.